What is going on, everyone? This is time for my film reveal video. This is where I take a look at my film from my spring backpacking trip for the very first time. I got my camera overhead, got this camera here, got my light box, got my film over here, and I exposed 11 sheets of Fuji Provia 100F. And I'll just remind you that the film is in protective sleeves, so I can handle it just fine without worrying about fingerprints or anything like that. So let's take a look and see how we did. All right, so this is the very first scene that I photographed on the trip. And this is actually not far at all from where I was camped. And I have a tendency to wander around a lot when I get back to camp. I just can't really sit still. And I found this tree last year, so I decided to revisit it this year as the first subject to photograph. And I just love the twisted branches and the texture of the bark on these juniper trees. And I love the simple background. And then you have this area with cryptobiotic soil. I like this shape right here to counteract that. So you have a little bit of this kind of pulls you this way, this pulls you this way, and it counterbalances. This is taken with my 240 millimeter lens, which is equivalent to maybe about a 28 millimeter. And I'm glad that lens worked because one of my tripod legs was like right on the very edge of this sandstone slope, so I couldn't have gotten back any further. But let's say we did on sharpness. Oh yeah, it's very, very sharp. And it was absolutely calm when I shot this. No tricky camera movements or anything. I just focused basically right on the tree there. And I'd say the amount that's critically in focus is probably from there, the tree, a little bit beyond the tree. I lose a little bit this, but that's perfectly fine. I didn't want to do any weird stuff if I use some front tilt, what happens is some weird stuff happens with the background and also with perhaps the base of the tree. So it's actually very sharp. And this, as well as all the other sheets, are on Fuji Provia. So I'm quite happy with that. I'll need to tweak the contrast a little bit, perhaps warm it up a little bit. But Provia has a very nice smoothness to it. And so I'm quite happy with that. It's a good start. Same scene, but you'll notice the light's a little bit different. And I don't really know which one I shot first. This exposure is certainly a little bit brighter. Now, I shot one of them when there was a little bit of reflected light further away, but then that light started creeping closer, and perhaps that's what this one is. I really like this one. It has a bit more warmth to it, and you get a little more fill light in there. So I really like that. Make sure that we are nice and sharp, and we are, as expected, because there was no wind. There's a lot of wind on the trip, but this particular morning was very calm. And I really do like that, because the cryptobiotic soil is a feature found in the Southwest. And there's some areas with this really dense built-up soil like this. You want to be careful not to step on that, because it can take, I don't know how long it can take, but it can take a long time for that to form. And this soil, this cryptobiotic soil, helps fend off erosion. And so these plants wouldn't be able to live here if this soil was walked on, because then that would erode away and perhaps that juniper wouldn't be living there as well. So it was like this nice little Zen garden of cryptobiotic soil and a beautiful juniper. So I'm very happy with that. I think that might make for a nice print. All right, so this is a tree I first photographed last year. There was some wind movement, and then also there was a light leak. And so I wanted to reshoot it this year. Now, it's a tricky scene, and as it stands right now, I'm not 100% on the composition. The bottom feels a little chopped off. I feel like there's a little too much up top. but there were some very distracting elements immediately out of view on the bottom. And I think when I composed this, I figured I could crop in a little bit if necessary. So if I were to lose a little bit of the top, and perhaps a little bit of the side to maintain the aspect ratio, maybe something about like that, it does balance a little bit better. So I might be able to make that work. I love this branch right here, sort of curly, and this is an oak tree. And I think it was fairly calm when I shot this. Yeah, it's very calm. I don't see any leaf movement. I'd say I'm perhaps a hair dark on the exposure, but not bad. But I think if I were to brighten this up just a little bit, crop a little off the top, crop a little bit off the right, I think I could make it work. I had a very low camera placement because I was trying to place as much of this trunk structure here up against the wall in the background. So we'll see how it goes. I'm a little dark in here, but I have all the detail I really need. But I wouldn't have minded being a little brighter. Also, if I had the camera tilted a little more like that. But we'll see. Since I need a crop anyways, I might be able to make that work. But the wind was calm. So, not bad. So this was a rather interesting scene I found while walking through the Salt Canyon. These are some sort of minerals. I don't know if it's salts or other sorts of minerals that are coming back out of the sandstone. So after it floods and you have all the water going through the Salt Canyon, I think the sandstone soaks up some of those minerals and then they come out. And it was interesting because it came out with these outlines filled in, and it reminded me of clouds in the sky. And there was this interesting pattern with this diagonal emphasis. And then you also have the pattern of the layers of the sandstone itself. And I shot this one without a warming filter. I believe it was a 1 second exposure. I think I was like f/36. I typically like to stop down a little bit more, but this is a fairly flat scene. And it is very sharp. I mean, it was tilted at a bit of a plane, but using a little front tilt, a little front swing, I was able to follow it. It'll be really interesting to scan this one in and to see how it does. But it definitely was a very abstract sort of image. But I just love these nice outlines with it kind of shaded in there, and then the diagonal emphasis. So it'll be interesting to see how that one does. That was a very interesting scene. Very well suited for Provia as well. All right, next up. So this is probably about, I'd say, maybe 100 feet, maybe less than that from the last scene. And this was taken the next morning. Now I noticed this scene for the first time, I believe, last year. As I was hiking through the canyon in the morning, the sunlight is hitting the cliff face right out of camera up here, which is sending a nice warm backlighted reflected light into the scene. And I really like this large white rock here to anchor the scene, and then the wash meanders around. And off in the background, there is a cottonwood trunk that had been slammed up against the canyon wall on the right there during a flash flood, and it's just hanging there suspended. And I used a little bit of front tilt to try to get everything from right about here up to right about there in focus, and then stop down to f/45. Let's see how we did on sharpness. Oh yeah. Very, very sharp. Very good. Initially, I was a little concerned with regard to the focus in the background. And I wasn't sure if I should try to get this tree back here in focus, or whether I have the plane of focus drop a little bit below that and maybe sacrifice this a little bit. In the end, I decided to make sure I had this in the plane of focus, but I have everything there. The very, very top, I lose a little bit, but it's perfectly fine. I do like the composition, I do like the light. Exposure is spot on. And I believe I shot 2 variations of this with and without a warming filter. And I believe this is my 240 millimeter lens. So we'll see what else I have. But I do quite like that. It'll be interesting to scan it, see how it is. Okay, so here's the same variation, this time with a warming filter. And I'm still trying to figure out when I should and shouldn't use the warming filter. And although this is perfectly fine, I do think I prefer the version without the warming filter, because you have some of the natural blue tones, and as a result you get some nice color contrast. And I could always warm this up a little bit and still maintain those blue tones. But you can definitely see how the warming filter does, well, it warms things up a little bit. And I should mention that all these were taken with a new camera, Chamonix Alpinist X 8x10 camera, and I really love that camera. Very precise, very lightweight. It's a little bit heavier and a little bit larger than the Intrepid 8x10, but it's a little smoother in terms of the controls, and there's a few other nice things about it. I'll do a video about that camera in a bit. But I do like some of the lines in here that lead in. So it's pretty nice. All right, so this is the second canyon that I backpacked into. The lighting for this is not great, but I pretty much knew that when I was photographing it. What happened is that there were some clouds in the sky. So there's some clouds over here to the left. Now, to the right and behind me, there's this large, huge section of sandstone that the light should be hitting and reflecting light into the scene. So you should have some nice warm reflected light coming in from this angle. But it just wasn't really, the clouds and then that light were competing. It was really windy. And so I know the light can be so much better on this one. There should be a nice warm glow to it, and it just doesn't really have that. Let's see how we did on wind. There is some wind motion on the tree. It's not horrendous, but it's definitely there. This is a scene I would love to reshoot when I revisit that canyon. Let's talk about the composition though. This was fairly close to where my campsite was. And I loved this structure here with the rock. And I've also been trying to learn a lot more about the various sandstone layers. And I believe with the really strong horizontal banding and all the various layers, I believe this is the Kayenta formation of sandstone. I could be completely wrong, but I believe that's what that is, which I believe is from like the Jurassic era. But I loved this tree right here with the 3 primary trunks. Fit really nicely into this gap between these boulders, a little bit of water through there. So this is a scene I would love to photograph when I get some nice reflected light. I think it would work quite well. Might also be interesting in the fall, if I could time it that way. But I think it's a solid composition. I think it's a good subject. I just didn't quite have the light I was hoping for. And there's a little bit of wind. But it was a very beautiful scene. So that is one I'd like to revisit again when I return to that canyon. And I will return to that canyon. This one definitely has a glow. I'd say I'm a hair bright on the exposure, but not in a bad way. When I was determining the exposure for this one, I was paying close attention to this dark area here, these bright areas here and back there. So that's what I was basing the exposure on. Provia has a very nice smoothness to it, which you can see in the way that like the trunk here looks and some of these areas in here. So it actually has a fairly generous dynamic range for a slide film. On this particular day, it was very windy. There were a lot of clouds. So this glow was kind of like turning on and off as the sun was being blocked by clouds, and then clouds were going over, and then the shadows were falling on the sandstone, which is off to the right, which is reflecting light in the scene. Compositionally, you can see I'm running right up against the edge of the cliff there. I wanted to include a bit of this to give some context for the flow of the water. I like the tree. I wanted to have some space there. I was okay chopping off a little bit of the left. Maybe I should chop off a little bit more. I'll have to scan this, darken it down a little bit, see if I can separate the tones a little bit by maybe adding a little bit more blue perhaps. So we'll see how that goes. In terms of sharpness, it is very sharp. I do have a little bit of wind movement on the branches and on the trees. It's not bad though. A little bit of wind movement's okay. This may perhaps be a scene I could do better with. As far as composition, I think it's pretty decent though. But I might be tempted to crop in maybe a little more there. And then I might have to give up a little bit of the base perhaps. So maybe something like that. I do need to give up a little bit of that as well. But we'll see. I'll have to scan it. I'll have to see how it does. Those trees are so cool though. That canyon had some really cool trees. So same canyon as the previous one. This beautiful cottonwood tree had some really interesting sandstone formations here. I believe this is carved by the wind. And then we have some interesting plants there, so you get the color contrast of the greens against the oranges. Really strong reflected light on the scene. And this was a very, very windy day, but there were some breaks in the wind. I feel like I need to have a bit more color separation in this, which might mean adding maybe some cyan or some blue, or taking away some magenta, something along those lines to help give a little more color separation between the warm and the cool tones. I'm good at the composition. I always try to give myself plenty of space in the foreground. So that space, that space, that space, that all looks pretty good. Let's see how we did on sharpness. Tiny bit of wind movement, not horrible, but a tiny bit of wind movement. I believe I have 2 sheets on this. So if this is all I had, I think I'd be okay with this. But I should have another sheet as well. There's also an interesting formation in the sandstone right there. I should have another one of those as well. Okay, same scene. I guess the question is this one any better with regard to wind? I believe it is. There's still a tiny bit of wind, but overall, it's quite good. Because, you know, a tiny bit of wind is okay. It gives that extra sense of place, extra sense of the other senses. You can kind of, you know, feel the wind on your arms and on your face and all that sort of stuff just based on seeing a little bit. That gives extra sense of what's going on. So I think this is the better of the two. But again, I'll need to do a little something to help separate the tones a little bit. I think it might have to do with adding a little bit of cool tones. So we'll see on that. But good on composition, good on exposure. So that'll be a fun one to scan and see how it does. Final sheets. So this tree is located not far from the previous tree. It's maybe, I don't know, it's about a 30-second walk down the canyon from the previous one. I do like this background wall. It has some interesting wind-carved areas. I feel like I could lose a little bit of the top. That might help balance it a little bit more with the base. If I do that, I have to lose a little bit of perhaps the side. So maybe something a bit like that will help to calm it a little bit, somewhere in that range. This is a scene where I visually leveled the composition, which, because the tree's at a slight angle, but I wanted it to be fairly true. The desert varnish in the background is very seldom perfectly straight, but I wouldn't mind, I'm gonna have to do a slight rotation in there to make that work a little bit better. But let's see how we did on wind. This one is very, very good. Slight wind movement, but not bad. When you consider this is a backpacking trip where I only had 8 sheets of film, and you're waiting for that moment when the wind is absolutely calm, and sometimes you get it, sometimes you don't, but I think this worked out pretty well. I'll have to scan it and play with it a little bit, but I do think maybe if I lose a little bit of that side, a little bit of the top, just a subtle crop, maybe something like that. That might give me a little more of what I'm looking for. But beautiful tree and a beautiful scene. So I think there's some definite potential with this group of film. Some of them I think it'll be a matter of scanning it to really see how it works out. But that's probably my favorite of the bunch. I do like the subtle color. I do like this shape. Everything is so nicely arranged there. Some nice lines in the background to make it dynamic. So I'm looking forward to scanning that and the other ones and see how it all turned out. And the second canyon I visited, it's a canyon I'm going to return to year after year after year. There's so much potential in that canyon. And so it's going to be a great canyon to get to know through the years. But I want to thank everyone for watching, and we'll see you around next time. If you enjoy this ad-free and clickbait-free content and want to help me live my dream, a voluntary contribution of just $24 a year helps keep my gas tank full and my film freezer stocked. For more information on how to support me and my work, please visit the donation section of my website at benhorn.com/donate. I also have prints in my portfolio box set available on my website. You can find a direct link down below in the show notes. Thanks in advance for your support.